Hello, Pedro here. This is a quick rundown on range sweep, a HDA digital asset for the VOP network that I created to make my life easier when I quickly want to have some transition over a gradient or have this pulse-like animation. So let's look into my base case, which is usually dealing with curves. So I have here this curve and it has a U based on this our sample option to generate a curve U, and it goes from 0 to 1. So start of the curve to the end of the curve. And so many times I want to have a transition, an effect that is generated and that it starts and grows up from the start of the curve, and when I'm finished, the whole curve has the effect applied. And so let's look into that. Have this polywire and have this VOP that has the range sweep inside with the curve U attached into the value. So usually one should first define the range, but since the faults are from 0 to 1 and the curve U is also from 0 to 1, I don't need to change anything. What I can change here to show what this is all about is if I change here the bias, you can see that I have this transition from the start of the curve to the end of the curve growing. And I can not only change the transition, I can also change its span. And so if I come here and I put 0.1, now I have this gradient that goes from 0 to 1 by this value. And this value is a percentage. So if the range, the beginning and the end of the range was, let's say, from 0 to 2, that would have a length of 2. And this 0.1 would be a percentage of that. So this is not an absolute span distance. It's a span percentage from the defined range. So I can change these two. I can change also if this goes from the beginning of the curve to the end, or if it goes from the end to the beginning. So now instead of growing from this side, it grows from this side. So let's look into other options, and with another example, I have here this grid, and it's a grid that goes from -3 to 4, and will allow me to show a little bit better some of the options. So in this case, I have this position going into the value, and there's an automatic demotion from vector to float. So the X value of this grid is being used, and that is being plugged on the color, and also there's some displacement going on the Y-axis. And so you can see as I change the bias that basically what's happening is that the gradient is dying off because I have this clamp on. If I put this on continue, we can see what's actually going on. So just basically moving the gradient from this area to this area. And usually, since most of the attributes or gradients I'm dealing with are from 0 to 1, well, I'm just going to see the gradient moving along. I don't actually see the gradient sitting on here or here. So if I come here and I put this to 1, all I can see usually is just a transition going on, and that's it. I can again choose the span, and that means I have a shorter transition span. So if I put here 0.1 or if I put 0, it becomes a very abrupt transition. But this is a good example to show this extrapolation option or a different range. So if I come here and I change this again to 7, and I change, let's say, the range from -1 to 2, now I have a length 3 range, and let's say that I change here the bias. So this goes from -1, and as I change the bias, this will go up to 2. Or if I change this span, you'll notice that there's more going on, and I'll have that transition going. Now instead of having just the basically this simple linear transition, I can also have a modulo, and this modulo and the extrapolation will make that there's a repetition of that range. So from -1 to 1, I have this gradient, and then it repeats. And so that allows me that, let's say I put this to 11, or even let's say 21. You can see that this pattern repeats. Also, if I put here the oscillate, it will repeat, but by going from white to black to white to black, and you can see here better how this looks like. Right, so what this allows me, this modulo, for example, allows me, if I choose a span that is very small, and I come here to the ramp, and I put some white values in the middle, and I put the black values in the extremities. Now I have this pulse. And usually one would animate this bias, but you see that it gets to the end of the range, and that's so I don't want that. So that's why I put here this phase attribute. And so this allows me to animate that. And so now I quickly have a way, if I put the time connected to the phase, I have a way to quickly generate a repeating pulse. So I can choose the size of the period. So in this case it's 3, but I could say, from 0 to 4, but then I would want the white part just be something quite small, let's say 0.1 of that, or I could have something tighter. So I could have this be 1, but then this also to be like 0.25, something like that. And so this is basically a way to get these sort of repeating pattern pulses going on. So if I put this back to 1, you can see that now I have this sweep repeating, and I can have, if I this is the range that I'm dealing with, I can have more pulses per range, because if I change this, for example, from 0 to 0.5, now I have 2 of them, or 0 to 0.333, now I have 3 pulses, and again I can still choose what's their size. Also, if I change this, for example, to oscillate, seems very similar, but as I change the bias, you can see that now I have the pulses getting closer to each other. So let's look into a more complex example, which is the one here with the rings. So basically I have a UV for these. Basically it was done from a grid, and I have a UV for these guys, and then they are being bent into these circles. So if I mute the bend and I run the timeline, you can see that basically I have a quick way to randomize the creation of some pulses. So basically they have different speeds, they have different periods, different spans. And so if I come inside here, let's look into what's going on. So I have the range sweep, and it's getting a lot of random values generated from this strand attribute. It's basically an integer attribute for each of these tubes. And so a lot of those random values being basically, I can choose what's the interval, what's the variation that these random values are creating. So for example here, for the range, the end of the range, I have 1 to 5, so I'll have ranges that begin in 0 and go up to 1 or 5. So I can change that by putting, for example, a bigger value in here and say 10. So now I increase that, or if I put 3, now they'll just go from between 1 and 3. So it's a way for me to quickly add this sort of variation. So let me put here 5 again. If I run this, you can see this, and if I just offset this integer value, I can quickly change the configuration of what I'm seeing. So if I increase this by integer amounts, I can quickly see the variation shifting and things change. So hopefully you'll see other applications for this. So my goal is definitely to make a linear wipe based on an attribute, and there's many situations, not just curves, where that can be useful. So yeah, let me know what you think. Cheers.